So, you want to get to the bottom of this whole Governor Newsom thing with trans athletes and why everyone's freaking out about it?
It's definitely got people talking, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty, complicated, right? With tons of, implications for all sorts of things. And we've got a bunch of sources that kind of offer different perspectives.
Right, it's a big one. And it, goes way beyond sports, doesn't it? We're talking like the future of the Democratic Party, the 2028 election, maybe even like a turning point for how America views trans rights and this whole identity politics thing.
Okay, so let me try and break this down.
Okay.
So Newsom goes on this podcast with Charlie Kirk, who, is pretty conservative, and says allowing trans athletes to compete in women's sports is deeply unfair.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, going on Kirk's show, that was like a pretty deliberate choice.
Oh, yeah, he knew exactly what he was doing. I mean, think about the reaction. It was huge, and everyone had something to say.
I mean, you had, Lori Lightfoot, who is a big supporter of LGBTQ plus rights as mayor of Chicago, calling Newsom's comments disgusting. And Pramila Jayapal, she's the head of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, she's basically saying, don't give in to the, the anti-trans stuff.
And then the Human Rights Campaign, they're like the biggest LGBTQ plus group, right?
Sure.
They basically said turning your back on vulnerable communities is not a great look if you want to win in 2028.
Yeah, but not all Democrats are totally against what he said, are they?
No, not at all. You've got some moderate Democrats, Representative Seth Moulton, he's a former Marine who represents Massachusetts.
Yeah.
He actually praised Newsom. His argument is that this is the Democrats getting real about what most Americans actually think and moving away from this, identity politics stuff that they see as fringe.
Sure.
And you even have some Democratic strategists, anonymously, saying that their voters are, okay with restricting trans athletes, especially at the youth and college levels, and that Newsom is just saying out loud what a lot of people are already thinking.
So this whole identity politics idea seems to be at the heart of this.
Yeah.
How would you even define that, and why is everyone so fired up about it?
Well, identity politics is one of those terms, right? It means different things to different people. Basically, it's about political action based on the shared experiences of specific groups like racial minorities, LGBTQ plus folks, women,
Mm-hmm.
For some people, it's about making sure those who've been marginalized have a voice and their rights are protected.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have people who say it's too focused on what makes us different instead of what unites us.
Yeah.
And it can turn into this who's been treated worse competition where groups are fighting for, recognition and resources.
So it seems like Newsom and maybe some other moderate Democrats, they want to get away from that identity politics label, thinking it's bad for them politically.
Yeah, that could be it. I mean, 2028's coming up and Newsom is definitely thinking about running. But what's interesting is that no other potential candidates have publicly supported him on this. So is he isolating himself? Or is he tapping into, a group of voters that other Democrats are ignoring? It's hard to say.
And we can't forget about how Trump, used this whole thing to his advantage,
right?
Especially against Kamala Harris in 2024.
Right.
And even Newsom admitted that those attacks were, really effective. So is this all just copying Trump's playbook?
That's the question, isn't it? Is Newsom just trying to score points, or has he actually changed his mind on this whole trans rights thing? I mean, this is the same guy who, as mayor of San Francisco, was a huge advocate for same-sex marriage. He even went against federal and state law to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples.
Yeah, so that is a big difference. And some of his, former allies feel like he's totally abandoned them.
Yeah, you have people like Chris Ward, a California assembly member, who's been a big supporter of LGBTQ plus rights.
Yeah.
And he's really disappointed.
Yeah.
Basically saying Newsom is playing into Trump's divisive games.
So it's messy, right? You have personal ambition, this big social issue that keeps evolving, and Trump's shadow hanging over everything.
It's a lot to untangle.
Yeah, and it's easy to forget that in the middle of all of this are actual trans people, Their lives are being, directly affected by what these politicians are saying and doing.
Absolutely.
And it's not like public opinion is clear on this either.
No, it's all over the place. Pew Research did this study that showed that most Americans say they're for protecting trans people from discrimination.
Okay.
But in the same study, they also say they support making trans athletes compete based on the sex they were assigned at birth and limiting gender transition care for minors.
So it's they're for trans rights, but not for the things that actually protect trans people.
It's a weird contradiction, right? And it kind of goes back to what we were saying about identity politics, how loaded that term has become. It's like people are fine with the idea of equality as long as it doesn't, actually require them to change anything or, like, confront their own biases.
Wow. Yeah.
It's definitely complicated. And I think we need to look closer at how this is all going down in Congress and what it means for, the future of trans rights in America.
So we talked about, what the public thinks, but what about the people who can actually make laws? What's happening in Congress, and how are Democrats reacting to what Newsom said?
Well, you can bet everyone in Congress is watching this thing unfold. And yeah, the reactions from Democrats have been kind of all over the map, just like, those divisions in the party we were talking about.
But they have been pretty united when it comes to actually voting on laws about trans rights, haven't they?
That's true. And that's what makes this whole thing even trickier. Like earlier this year, the House voted on a bill that would ban trans athletes from competing in women's and girls' sports nationwide. Pretty much every Democrat voted against it, but their reasons were all over the place.
So, like, even though they all voted the same way in the end, they had different reasons for doing it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Some Democrats, like, Representative Moulton, they actually believe trans athletes shouldn't be competing in girls' sports. They say it just isn't fair. But others voted against it because they thought the bill was too broad, like badly written and just bad for trans kids.
Right, right.
And it's important to remember, legislation like this, it's often framed in a way that's really emotional. And the actual details of the bill, like what it actually says, can get lost in all the political back and forth.
That kind of seems like what happened with that Child Predator Empowerment Act thing that Democrats keep bringing up.
Oh, yeah.
Can you explain what that actually is, like what's in the bill, and why are people so upset about it?
Yeah, so first of all, the name itself, it's obviously meant to, like, get a reaction out of people. It's not the real title, by the way. It's what Democrats have been calling this bill that Republicans introduced earlier this year. The real name is the Save Women's Sports Act. And basically it says that schools have to verify the biological sex of their athletes.
Okay.
Which Democrats say could mean, like, invasive physical exams, which would be, really humiliating. And they call it the Child Predator Empowerment Act because they say it could make kids more vulnerable to abuse.
I mean, that's a pretty disturbing thought, and it kind of shows how sensitive this whole issue is, how easily things can get out of control.
Oh, for sure. And we're seeing these, like, really intense feelings play out everywhere, not just in Congress, but also in the media and just, like how people are talking about this. You have some Democrats, like Representative Latifah Simon from California. She's expressed disappointment with Newsom, but she didn't, like, attack him or anything. But then you have others, like Representative Sarah Jacobs, also from California. She's been much more direct, saying that, targeting trans kids for political gain is just wrong.
And it's interesting that Hakeem Jeffries, the House Minority Leader, he hasn't said anything directly about Newsom's comments.
Yeah.
But he has, said over and over that Democrats are against that Child Predator Empowerment Act, calling it dangerous and discriminatory.
Right, and we don't know if Jeffries not saying anything about Newsom means he agrees with him, disagrees with him, or is just trying to, like, keep things from getting even more divided within the party. It's a tough spot to be in.
Yeah.
And it shows the challenges that Democratic leaders are facing as they try to deal with all of this while trying to stay united.
So we've got this split within the Democratic Party. The public doesn't know what to think, and Republicans, it seems like, are happy to use this whole thing to their advantage. So where do we go from here? What does this all mean for, like, the future of trans rights and, the people who are actually at the center of this debate?
That's the big question, right? And unfortunately, I think the answer is that we're in for a lot more uncertainty. This whole thing has really revealed these deep cracks in the Democratic Party, and it's hard to say if they'll be able to come together on this or how they'll do it. This could be like a major turning point. Maybe it'll change how the Democratic Party approaches LGBTQ plus rights and, social justice issues in general.
So what might that change look like?
Well, on the one hand, you have this growing progressive wing of the party that sees trans rights as a fundamental human rights issue.
Right.
And they're probably going to keep pushing even harder, for more inclusive policies and calling out anything they see as transphobic.
And what about the other side?
Well, you have the moderate Democrats who are getting more and more worried about, what voters will think. They don't want to seem too woke or out of touch with, the average American. So they might be more open to compromise on some of these issues or even, like, back away from some of the more progressive positions, especially if they think those positions are, going to turn off swing voters.
So you're saying this could actually make the Democratic Party even more divided, with progressives wanting to go all in and moderates saying, hold on, let's be careful.
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. And it makes you wonder, was this whole thing a calculated move by Newsom? Like, was this his way of showing he's not afraid to break from the party line to try and appeal to more voters? Or did he really change his views on trans rights? I mean, remember, this is a guy who built his whole career on being a supporter of LGBTQ plus equality.
Yeah, it's hard to square that with what he's saying now, and I'm sure a lot of people who used to support him are feeling pretty confused.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember, we're not just talking about, like, some abstract political debate.
Right.
This is about real people's lives, and the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's easy to get caught up in all the political stuff, the arguments, the media coverage. But at the end of the day, this is about making sure that trans people have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else.
Exactly. And I think that brings us to something else we need to talk about, the whole idea of public perception and how hard it is to take this general support for equality and turn it into actual changes in policy.
So we were just talking about, how this isn't just about politicians playing games. We have to think about, like, the actual lives of trans people. Who are the ones really at the center of all of this? And it kind of goes back to what you said before about public opinion, how it's kind of a mixed bag, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Like, remember those Pew Research findings we talked about?
Right.
Where, most Americans say they support protecting trans people from discrimination, but then they also support things like making trans athletes compete based on the sex they were assigned at birth and making it harder for minors to get, it's called gender-affirming care.
Right.
So that's the big challenge for, people advocating for trans rights. How do you make those big ideas about equality actually happen when there's still so much fear and misunderstanding about, what it means to be trans?
So, like, people are okay with trans people, like, existing as long as they don't actually have to, like, see them or think about their lives.
Yeah, and Phil, unfortunately, I think that's kind of true. And it makes this whole thing so much more complicated and difficult. We're not just debating some, like, abstract legal stuff or political strategy. We're talking about real people's lives, their sense of self, their basic human rights.
It's easy to forget that when you're hearing all the political talk and what the media is saying.
Yeah.
We have to remember that behind all that are real people who are being really affected by this.
Absolutely. What we're really talking about here is making sure that trans people are treated with the same dignity, respect, and compassion as anyone else.
Right.
It's about creating a world where they can live authentically, express themselves however they want, and, pursue their dreams without being discriminated against or, God forbid, facing violence.
So how do we get there? How do we bridge the gap and make things fairer and more just for trans people?
That's the question, isn't it?
Okay.
And there's no easy answer. But I think it starts with education, empathy, and actually listening to and learning from trans people.
Okay.
We have to move past all the fear-mongering and stereotypes and misinformation that's out there and have real, honest conversations about what it means to be trans in America today.
Yeah, that's so important. We need to create spaces where trans people feel safe to share their stories and where people who don't understand can ask questions and learn without feeling judged.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we have to go into those conversations, humbly, recognizing that a lot of people have never really thought about this before. But I think through dialogue, shared experiences, and real human connection, we can start to break down the prejudice and ignorance that leads to discrimination.
Yeah.
We can create a society where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued, no matter what their gender identity is.
That's a great goal and a great point to end on, I think. This has been such an informative and interesting deep dive. We've covered a lot, looking at the political, social, and cultural sides of this issue. And I hope you, our listeners, understand this debate better now.
And as always, there's always more to learn and think about. This conversation isn't over, and it's important to stay engaged, informed, and committed to making the world a better, fairer place for everyone.
So keep asking questions, keep learning, keep listening, and most importantly, keep your mind open to new ideas and different points of view.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And until next time, keep diving deep.